Okay, so here's my simulator here. And so just to remind you, assuming not everyone remembers exactly what we talked about last time, we have the energy supply over here. So we have our fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, and then bioenergy, which would be like wood, or biofuels like ethanol, renewables, so solar and wind, and hydro and everything, tide energy, all that would fit into renewables. Nuclear power, some new technology that we don't know about yet, like probably some type of a nuclear power breakthrough, like nuclear fusion or thorium-based fission. We have a carbon price, which sits in the energy supply section, but is kind of separate policy instrument. Then we have our transport. We can either increase the efficiency of transport, like miles per gallon. We can electrify transport, switch out all the internal combustion cars to electric cars like Teslas. Building and industry, so we can increase the energy efficiency of buildings by increasing insulation, that type of thing. Electrification, having a lot less gas for heating and cooking, and having that all done through electricity. We have population growth, how many people are on the planet, and economic growth. So because everything that we consume economically depends on how many people there are, and because basically our energy system still runs on fossil fuels, the more we consume, the more emissions there are. And so economic growth is a big kind of lever on temperature. Then we have our land and industry emissions, so how much deforestation there is, all other greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons are all in this lever. And then we have carbon removal, so getting carbon out of the atmosphere, either by growing trees, so then the carbon is in the forest, or some type of a technological solution like carbon capture or direct air capture, where you have a machine that's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. But I just want to go through these and look at, individually what they might do to the global temperature. So if we start off, this is our baseline here. We're at 4.1 degrees Celsius by 2100. So an additional 3.1 degrees Celsius above today. And that's largely driven because they have in their baseline scenario just the continued increase of fossil fuel use throughout the remainder of the century. So, right now we have gas, oil, and coal are the #1 sources of energy, and they just continue to grow throughout the remainder of the century. So renewables grow, but they never overtake them in their baseline scenario. And so that's controversial to think of that as the baseline, but that's kind of a pessimistic baseline starting point. But so if we, for example, do the coal lever and we say, okay, very highly taxed, we go from 4.1 Celsius to 3.8. So we have 0.3 in the coal. And if we just kind of look through each one of these, like none of them really do all that much on their own. So oil just gives you 0.1 degrees. Natural gas gives you 0.1 degrees. Bioenergy isn't really going to do anything. It's going to kind of shift around energy. So like one of the reasons, coal is the best in terms of temperature reductions, per, I guess, dollar of taxation here. But one of the reasons that it doesn't do more is just because of substitution effects, where you tax coal and you see that the coal line goes down when you tax it, but natural gas goes up. So natural gas takes over part of that energy supply if you just tax coal. So that's one of the reasons why like this simulator is useful, is it's going to show you things like that wouldn't be there if you just said, oh, if you tax coal by a certain amount, then it's going to reduce coal, and the other things you're not going to think about that the other things are going to respond in a way that would compensate that. So if we go to renewables, okay, that's only giving us 0.2. You kind of get a theme here that that most of these are only like 0.2 2 or 3. You get to carbon price. Carbon price is a big one. So just this knob alone gives us 1.2 degrees of temperature savings. Let's go through the rest of them. This is 0.3, 0.1, 0.1, 0.5. So energy efficiency in buildings is a big one. Population in either direction, pretty big. GDP growth is pretty big leverage. Of course, more GDP growth is more temperature by itself. Reducing deforestation, not that high leverage. These other greenhouse gases are pretty big. And carbon dioxide removal, it's pretty good, 0.4. Afforestation, 0.1. So if we summarize this in the slide, we go back to here. So these are all of the numbers. And so we can see like relative to each other. And again, it's not this simple because you want to be able to combine things, and that's how you end up seeing, that's the real utility of the model. But you can see like individually, like what tends to have the highest leverage. And it looks like overall, the carbon price has the highest leverage of all of the different levers. And then the other ones that are big are energy efficiency in buildings, greenhouse gases other than CO2 are a big one. If we can find technological improvements to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that's a big one. And then like of our fossil fuels, taxing coal is better than taxing oil or natural gas, just because coal has a larger CO2 emission per unit of energy produced. And so taxing that will get you more bang for your buck in terms of temperature change. So I would say that this kind of gives us two important concepts coming out of this. So I'd say that because nothing gets us by itself close to, the Paris type goals, that there's not one weird trick to solve climate change. And it kind of, that dashboard implies that it requires the passage of a bunch of different policies and initiatives in different sectors of the economy in order to get us down closer to like a goal of 2 degrees, for example. But we do still see that different knobs, have different effects. And so some changes have larger effects than others. Here's an example of getting us to below the 2 degree threshold. And like, yeah, you can see that, you're manipulating a bunch of different things in here. And in this case, I assumed a lower population growth and a lower economic growth as well to get to this goal. So this would mean that, you'd have to kind of create a patchwork of a bunch of different policies, which is not ideal, especially globally. And then there's also costs associated with these policies. So that's something else that the model can show us. So if we do, let's reproduce that. So if I do tax coal, oil, natural gas, and if I look at, so they have this financial category, cost of energy. So this shows that when we tax these energy sources, the cost of energy goes up. And so that's another thing, to keep in mind, that when you're manipulating these things, they're not free. And so if you're taxing these things, a lot of times, we think of that as, oh, it's taxing like the power plant or the utility or the the company, and it won't necessarily be passed on to me, but it essentially will. It essentially does get passed on to society more broadly. And so that's another, lesson of this, is that you don't get to do these things for free either. Okay, so that means, given that there are costs that are shown in this model, it's not, immediately obvious just from the model that the costs that are incurred by these types of policies justify the benefits. And that's really an argument that needs to be made. It needs to be articulated in order to convince people to actually implement these policies. And that's, especially true just given kind of the public perception of the relative importance of the economy versus environmental issues like climate change. So this is just an example of that. Percent of people polled who say, this is Pew Research, who say that these various issues should be a top priority for the government. And this is very common, right? The economy comes out as the most important thing that people care about, that they want the government to deal with. And climate change is down here. So that means that any costs associated with solving climate change will need to be kind of justified in order to win over people that are much more concerned about economic issues than environmental issues. So what I want to do for the rest of this meeting is talk about what basically I think does that. It's essentially the closest thing to one weird trick for solving climate change, in my opinion. And it does explicitly justify the costs of dealing with climate change in terms of the benefits that are accrued economically for doing that. And so what that is a carbon price. So it's this carbon price lever down here. And specifically, it's not just any carbon price. It's a carbon price or a carbon tax that's set equal to what's called the social cost of carbon, which you may have heard of before. So first, let's just look a little bit more at this carbon price in this model. So with each one of these levers, you can click on the triple dots, and it will give you more options to look at in terms of different things you can manipulate. And then over here, there's this help icon with the I on it. So it's kind of like info, I think. And so then this tells you a bunch more information about that lever. So carbon price, so set a global carbon price. So this is synonymous with carbon tax. It's meaning that you can emit carbon, but you have to pay some entity like the government of your country in order to do that. So it would make coal, oil, and gas more expensive, directly proportional to how much carbon dioxide they release. And so they just make the point that I just made. The energy producers frequently pass additional costs to their customers. So policy must be designed to minimize the impact on the poorest. So if a higher proportion of your income is going towards basic energy needs, then a carbon tax is going to be disproportionately affecting your well-being. Yeah, they give you some numbers on what a low, medium, and high carbon tax would be. So let's just pick up on that. So here, a low would be $0 to $20 per ton of CO2. Medium is $20 to $60 per ton of CO2, and high is 60 to 100, and very high is 100 to 250. And so then the question is, okay, we want to tax carbon. That's our simplest way of limiting the thing that we care the most about, is we want to reduce CO2 emissions. So let's not do it on this case by case kind of piecewise. Let's not do it in that way. Let's do it like just at the source, simple, with a carbon price. But what should we set this price at, is the question. And like, is it, just to take the extreme example, is it best to set it at infinity dollars starting tomorrow? And, if you think about it, like that would be totally disastrous because our current society still runs on infrastructure that is releasing CO2. So if you were to literally say like no more CO2 tomorrow, that would just completely shut down the entire worldwide economy and trade, and there would be no transportation. Everything would just shut down. But so even more, so that just means that like, okay, there is a limit to like how fast and how high the price should be. But even like taking a less extreme example, so the high end here is $250 per ton of CO2. And so if you just think about this like applied to your car, because the carbon price is not just going to go on companies or factories or utilities, it would be imposed on everything. And so thinking about like your vehicle, I just pulled this from the EPA. So their calculations show that a typical passenger vehicle emits 4.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year. So 4.6 times $250 per metric ton is $1,150. So that's the costs that we're having to reckon with. So that would just be one, portion of your life. But most people would not welcome an additional $1,150 just to drive their car every year. And so that's just, that's the reality here, is that we need to justify the costs of these things in terms of the benefits that are accrued. And so hopefully this wouldn't actually happen, like where it would just jump to $250 immediately and then everyone is paying an additional $1,150 immediately on their car. It would ramp up, and so then that would cause there to be a gradual shift towards more efficient vehicles and towards electric vehicles. And so then that cost would be spread out a little bit. But the point here is that there's costs that need to be justified. So there is a way to justify these costs. And it's basically this social cost of carbon concept. So I'm going to be showing this concept in as simple a way as I can with a very, very, very simple model of the economy and carbon. So when we think about like the economy, like the main measure of economic output that we hear about is GDP, gross domestic product. And so that's all the goods and services produced within a country in a year and exchanged for money. And when we think about, this is all like at the global level, so it doesn't really make sense to call it GDP at the global level, because domestic refers to like your home country, but that is what it tends to be called. So they call it like global GDP. But sometimes you'll see gross world product. But in either case, it just means all of the goods and services that are produced. And so those flow in the jargon of economics to households. And households are just people, it's just us. So everyone is a consumer of goods and services. And so I have, like very basic goods and services like food and water, a little bit more luxurious goods and services like washing machines, and then more luxurious like iPads, and then haircut is my service here. So people consume goods and services, and they have to pay for that, right? That's just our way of, instead of trading for things, we use money so that you don't have to find someone that wants to trade with exactly what you're producing. So we call that spending, and that goes towards, in economics jargon, firms, which are just companies. And so the companies, when they get the money, they call that revenue. And so this is just kind of like the economics lingo, is that when it gets to the firms, it's called revenue. So the firms are producing goods and services, the households are consuming them, sending money to firms to produce more goods and services. So we have that loop. But then of course, the firms are not just entities that exist by themselves, they're essentially made up of people. They're made up of us, right? So we go to work and we are the same people producing the goods and services. So the households under this model, this is like typically the first figure in economics textbooks. It's called the circular flow diagrams, if you want to Google image other versions of this. But the households supply labor to firms, and then the firms, in the form of wages, pay the people to work, and so that is income towards the household. So labor is supplied to firms from the households, and then you have wages, which turns into income towards the people, and then the people are consuming goods and services. And so this is our super simple economy here. And so what ends up happening with pollution in general, but I'll just focus on carbon, is that you have kind of outside of this exchange economy here, you have what gets called negative externalities, or just, these are just like detrimental byproducts of production. That when you're producing goods and services, you're some firm and you're producing goods and services, you have byproducts. And a lot of times those byproducts are detrimental. They harm something, they harm the environment in some way. So, you know, the classic example would just be like a pipe of toxic sludge flowing into a river. But in this case, we're talking about CO2 going into the atmosphere. So it is the case that most goods and services have carbon footprints associated with them because they are embodied energy which needed to burn fossil fuels in order to be produced. And so that causes problems. So there's a bunch of different problems associated with CO2. Some of them are quite non-monetizable. So it's hard to put a price on like the extinction of corals or ecosystems or things like that. Some are more monetizable, like reduction in agricultural yields. Like that's pretty easy to kind of figure out a price for, because there's, we sell these things, and so we know how much they cost. And the idea here, though, is that this CO2, this detrimental byproduct, is imposing these problems that are kind of, the problems are socialized. Like the exchange of goods and services are private exchanges between individuals, but then the problems are socialized. They're spread out amongst kind of the whole society, which is why it's called the social costs of carbon, because that just means it's spread out, it's amorphous. And what ends up happening is that when you have problems like sea level rise or decreased agriculture yields, that is going to, it's not just like it costs something in the sense of like it's bad. It actually, requires resources from the economy, like labor or materials, in order to deal with these problems. So like if sea level is rising and we need to build a seawall, that requires pulling labor away from other productive activities and materials away from other productive activities to build a seawall. And so those would have gone to creating other goods and services, but now they're creating something that just preserves what we already have. And so given that there's finite resources in the economy, this essentially means that you are going to be harming the economy by pulling resources away from these alternative uses. And so it ends up essentially reducing the total output, the total number of goods and services in the economy. So here I have it like our most luxurious good here is reduced because there are these problems that have to be dealt with. And so we need to pull resources away from producing goods and services in order to deal with these problems. So what happens here, the idea here with the social cost of carbon, is that the government steps in. So in this case, this is kind of like just a totally free market economy where you just have private exchange and markets. And so then the firms are going to just dump CO2 into the atmosphere and cause problems. And it's still in their best interest to do that because they get more from producing things, from producing goods and services and getting the revenue from that than it costs them to emit CO2, because that CO2 cost is spread out amongst everyone. And so it's still in their best interest to do that. And so that's why the government has to come in this case. And basically the government says, like, okay, firms, we like the goods and services, that's good. But your process is creating byproducts that are detrimental to society. It costs society something to deal with them. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna make you pay the true full cost associated with your process. And that cost has to include the costs associated with these problems that you're creating. And the vocabulary for this is called a Pigouvian tax. And so all that is a tax on pollution that is set. We're trying to get at, like, what should this number for the social cost of carbon be? Like, what should the actual dollar value be? And the Pigouvian tax idea is that the carbon price or the carbon tax should equal exactly what this social cost of carbon is. So the government says you have to, companies that are emitting CO2, companies that are polluting and creating social problems, you have to pay us this price that's equal to the cost of these problems. And so then the government is collecting revenue from that. And then the question is, like, what do you do with that revenue? So there's various proposals for that. So you can, funnel it into research and development for renewable energy if you wanted to kind of attack climate change on multiple sides. Or one prominent idea comes from, comes from a long time ago, but is mostly famous from the Citizens Climate Lobby. They have this, what do they call it? Dividend, so tax and dividend idea, where basically the revenue then just goes right back equally into the household, so into the pockets of individuals. But it doesn't, that's not the most important part, is like what the government actually does with it. The most important part is just that you are charging the firms, you're charging the companies the price that they are imposing on society by causing problems with their detrimental byproducts. And so hopefully the idea is, once the firm is paying the full social cost of their product, they usually find ways to innovate in order to avoid that tax, in order to avoid the cost. Yeah, does it matter if you put the tax on firms or households? So under very simplified assumptions about efficient markets and all that stuff, it doesn't matter whatsoever whether or not you tax the firms for emitting CO2 or whether or not you tax households for buying products that emit CO2. In either case, it will be essentially distributed not necessarily evenly. It depends on the elasticity of demand of the thing you're talking about, but it'll be distributed amongst both parties. And so it sounds a lot better from a voting perspective to say, yeah, tax the companies, because I don't want to be taxed. But that does end up being passed on to consumers of those products. Here's the idea is that then we have reduced detrimental byproducts because of this carbon price. And eventually, so in this diagram, there's no time dimension, but with the carbon tax, the idea is that that gets ratcheted up, incremented up over time. And eventually you kind of, you squeeze it out so that there's no more CO2 being produced. And so you just have a threat of a carbon price remaining, but now no CO2. And so what you've done is you've made it so that the firms, the companies have invested a bunch of resources, they've employed more labor in order to move their production process to a renewable energy type situation. So anything that's not emitting CO2. So in this case, I just have a wind, solar, and a battery. So storage of energy and renewable energy in our new economic system. But you can see here that it's not like this is a free pass. It's just like easy and all good. And if it was, then we wouldn't need these conference of parties negotiations every single year. Like we're on COP whatever 25, 20 whatever, and all these countries are getting together every year, and they're promising to reduce emissions, and like it's really difficult. Countries don't do it, and there's a reason they don't do it. The reason is because it costs it costs GDP of their country to do. So they have to divert resources away from other activities in order to decarbonize their economies. So they have to employ more labor, employ more resources, natural resources to build these things. And they would prefer not to do it if they don't have to. And so just to show you what like the IPCC calculates in terms of the costs of doing this, the costs of mitigation, this is a graph from the IPCC, the last major report. And so over here, we have carbon prices. So these are various, again, this thing, carbon price, how much you charge to firms for emitting CO2 or charge to individuals for buying products that emit CO2. So here's our carbon prices. And then these are consumption losses over here. So these are all, they're lined up so that it's like for a given carbon price, what's the consumption loss? And consumption loss means this part. How many goods and services are we sacrificing for these given carbon prices? And so here's one result. So reaching 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent by 2100. So this was, calculated in like 2010 when we were at more like 390 parts per million, but we're already at 410 parts per million right now. So this is like very quickly leveling off. Reaching 450 parts per million CO2 by 2100 would entail global consumption losses of 1 to 4% by 2030, 2 to 6% in 2050, and 3 to 11% in 2100, relative to consumption in the baseline scenarios. So here's our consumption loss percent of baseline and CO2 price. So the CO2 price is logarithmic here, so we're up to like over $1,000 per ton of CO2 in these more stringent scenarios that keep us at a level of CO2 that's close to where we are at now. So this is the level we're talking about. It's like 10% reduction in GDP. So here's just like a diagram of the infrastructure that would be kind of necessary for a zero carbon economy. And so this, we just have a bunch of things that we don't have today. And so you can think about that it takes people and resources to make these things. And those people and resources are pulled away from doing other things. In order to do this, you need kind of like the government to step in and make it happen, because the government, through science and scientists, has this foresight that's saying we have a problem down the road if we don't do this. And so you are sacrificing GDP in order to create this infrastructure, but then that saves you a bunch of GDP down the road, because we have enough fossil fuels available to raise temperatures like 10 degrees Celsius. So that would be just like clearly, you know, an existential, like extinction level type situation to raise extinction level for people. I mean, we're already extinction level for a lot of things. But to raise temperatures that largely, that fast, is just not anything that we want to come close to. And so these costs have to be justified through the costs of climate change that would be there without doing them. So this is what the cost of energy looks like under the very high carbon price. So $250 per ton of CO2. So cost of energy in this situation, if you just jump that up to $250 per ton in 2030, cost of energy does almost double. And so this is something that actually I did want to show you, that in En-ROADS, it's not gonna, if you play around with this and look at GDP, it's not actually going to harm GDP. So if I increase the carbon price here, and then I graph, if I look at GDP per capita, and so I have the business as usual and the current scenario, and these are right on top of each other. So this model is not doing what I was just describing, where it's feeding back in the price on GDP. And it actually says that in here, economic growth, go down here, model structure. Whereas in the real world, there would be feedbacks to economic growth from energy prices, that's what we're manipulating, various taxes, and the impacts of climate change. The model does not include these effects. Users could explore such feedbacks by changing the input manually. So this model is not doing what I just said these other more sophisticated models used by the IPCC are doing, which are calculating the GDP per capita change that would be induced from a carbon price. But it's also not calculating the change that would be induced from this 4.1 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature. So that should also be essentially harming GDP relative to a no climate change scenario. Okay, so how do we come up with this price though? So I explained, you know, the concept that it should be that you should price carbon at the cost if you want to optimize economic growth, which again, that's not the, you know, the full story necessarily. Like you can argue that like economic growth is not the variable we should be optimizing on. But this is kind of like, you know, how to talk to someone that only cares about the economy, about climate change. So in order to optimize economic growth, you want to price carbon at its social cost. And so how do you come up with that social cost? So going back to this question. And so I'm going to go back to this paper that's been brought up a couple times in this class, this Marshall Burke paper. Global Nonlinear Effect of Temperature on Economic Production. And so this paper is probably the most high profile, famous paper to look at this question of how does temperature affect economic production, and how temperature affects economic production then implies how CO2 affects economic production. So basically what they were doing is they wanted to look for an empirical relationship. They didn't want to just do a bunch of calculations of, hypothetically, like what would a seawall cost versus what would this cost, what would that cost. They wanted to look empirically in the past at actual data and find a relationship between GDP and temperature, which would imply this relationship between GDP and CO2. And so we have, for example, if we look at countries across space, we have countries with different GDP, and we know that the temperature changes across countries. So you could potentially get some relationship between GDP and temperature just by looking at countries across space in the current climate. And we do actually see kind of a relationship that way, where the hotter countries tend to be poorer countries, and more moderate temperature countries tend to be richer. But there's so many historical contingencies with that, and there's it just seems like it depends on history so much that that's kind of a questionable way to go about it. You could also look for a relationship over time. So this is, for example, temperature in New York City from 1750 to the early 2000s. And so it's warmed from the 1850s to 2000s by 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you could hypothetically say, oh, there's been this change in temperature over this long period of time in New York City, and there's been a change in GDP over that time. So then that could tell us like a relationship between temperature and GDP. But clearly, if you think about that for a little bit, like GDP in New York has increased a ton over this time period, and temperature has increased by some. And so you can't use that to say, oh, temperature causes GDP to increase, that it was the increase in temperature that caused GDP to increase. Like, we know the GDP increased because of increased productivity, because of increased specialization of people and jobs, and increased technology and all that stuff. So that would not be a good way of doing it either. But what this study did was something that's very clever, is that they used these short-term fluctuations in temperature. So if you look at like just kind of year-to-year variability in New York, you have just as much changes in temperature. So for example, from 2008 to 2010, you had a 3.5 degrees Celsius change in temperature. And you have a bunch of these variations over the past. And so you can use that to kind of derive a relationship between temperature and the economy, between temperature and GDP, because you know that like any type of confounding variable is either going to be moving too slow, or it's not going to be like correlated with temperature. And so like if you get some relationship at this time scale, it must be that temperature is causing the change in GDP. And so they did that, and they looked at every country in the world, and they basically found this relationship that you get. So we have on the x-axis temperature deviations, like these things. And then on the y-axis, we have change in growth of GDP. And these are different countries. And what they found is that warmer than average years are associated with higher than average GDP in some countries. And warmer than average years are associated with lower than average GDP in other countries. So different countries have different relationships. Sometimes warmer is better for the economy, and sometimes warmer is worse for the economy. And then the question is why? Why are some countries, when it's warmer, it's better, and some countries, when it's warmer, it's worse? And if you line those up in terms of their absolute temperature, so whether the country itself is in a cold climate or in a warm climate, you get this very interesting relationship where basically warm countries like Mali and Vietnam, when it's warmer, their economies grow less. So warm countries are harmed by increases in temperature, where cold countries are positively affected by increases in temperature. And so this implies that there's like an optimum temperature for economic growth. and it's at about like 13 degrees Celsius or 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And the United States happens to be right at that optimum level. And so they figured that this is essentially because as temperatures increase, more time is spent over particular thresholds that are bad for economic activity. So like 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit tends to be a temperature that once you cross that threshold, you get detrimental impacts on the economy. So this is one example of that change in labor supply and labor performance. So people working outdoors, when they've actually like studied this on a site-by-site basis, found that they get a lot less done when it's over 30 degrees Celsius. So days that are over 30 degrees Celsius. So that's just like one example. And then another example would be changes in crop yield. So a lot of crops, corn, soybean, I think corn and soybeans are the main crops that have this threshold effect at 30 degrees. Rice probably too. That above that threshold, you get large declines in yields. And so you have a situation where when you have warmer years, you have more days above that threshold. And so that's kind of the pathway that they think harms the economy. And so then what they did is they essentially used future projections of warming under a high emission scenario going through 2100, and they projected out, okay, what will happen to GDP in every single country in the world if we use this empirical relationship that we derived. And so red here is harm in GDP, so reduced GDP relative to a situation of no climate change. And then these are different regions, so everything below this line is a percent reduction in GDP per capita. And so Europe in particular is a region, since they're on that cold side of the optimum, they actually get helped by this analysis in terms, or as far as this analysis is concerned, they are helped by the warming because it moves them closer to the optimum level, that 55 degrees Fahrenheit, where basically every other region shows decline in GDP. And so if you add that all up at the global level, then you get this. So a 23% reduction in GDP by 2100 because of climate change. And so what I showed before was that it costs 10% of GDP to solve climate change. And this is saying it costs 23% of GDP to not solve climate change. So that's telling you that it's worth it, according to these calculations, it's worth it this century to do it. You don't even have to necessarily be talking about people, 300 years from now or whatever. This calculation suggests that you are already saving GDP by 2100 by decarbonizing the economy. Okay, so if I just do very high for carbon price, I get to 2.9. Let's see what would have to happen to max this out. So with a high carbon price, very quickly, we can get down to 2.4 Celsius. And then if we do, let's do methane and other, there you go. So the carbon price, the high carbon price, and the other greenhouse gases, which would have to be through other policies having to do with farming and agriculture and meat consumption. But with those two, I can get below 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. So I can get that higher version of the Paris Agreement. And this, with this tool, it's really showing like 1.5 is not achievable unless there's something totally unforeseen in terms of technological carbon removal. But this, what you're looking at right here, is the least knobs that you have to turn in order to get to 2 degrees or below 2 degrees Celsius. So this would be the closest thing to one weird trick to solve climate change. And we can, it turns out that when you plug these numbers in from this damage function from Burke et al., it's called a damage function, how much climate change damages the economy, damages GDP. If you plug that into these types of models, you do get a result that essentially says, okay, 2 degrees Celsius is the right target, even if you're trying to maximize economic output. And the Paris Agreement was not agreed upon in order to be the optimum economic situation. It was more like, okay, we're worried about a bunch of things that are non-monetizable, and so 2 degrees seems like a good target to aim at. But with this Burke estimate of how much climate change costs by itself, it actually does justify, from a purely economic perspective, the 2 degrees Celsius limit.